So the whole point is to see who's the best at fighting, at jiu-jitsu, at judo, at boxing, at kickboxing, Muay Thai, K1, whatever the rule sets are. You're there to test your ability to thrive under the worst forms of adversity that there are. And weight cutting should not be a part of that. We have weight categories so that we don't have huge people, 10, 15 kilos of muscle and bone heavier, which makes an enormous difference. Fighting people who are much lighter and smaller than them. I mean, that would just be cruel beyond belief and totally unfair. We try to level the playing field as much as we can. Weight cutting actually makes that leveling dangerous, because some people can cut far more for a whole range of physiological reasons. Some people, and genetics as well, can cut more weight than others. But people are compelled to compete. Instead of competing on a playing field that is inherently leveled by weight, it is now leveled by capacity, which varies enormously, to remove fluid from your body and then recover. Now, on average, a person can lose up to 2% of their body weight, and they may recover within 24 hours. So most people could lose a kilo of body weight in fluids, and they're usually okay within 12 to 24 hours. Some people could lose 2 kilos, 2, even 3. Most fighters, including my own, who are forced into this regime because otherwise you end up fighting enormous people, are forced to cut, 5 to 10 kilos. That's completely normal. Now, if you're a 100 kilo fighter, or a 100 kilo plus fighter, that's still a lot of weight. That's 10%. You're comfortably losing somewhere between 7 and 10% of your body weight in fluid. That is considered extreme dehydration. Medical doctors consider extreme dehydration. The cerebrospinal fluid that protects your brain, that wraps fluid around your brain, that fluid is depleted by as much as 40 to 50% during states of extreme dehydration, 5 to 10% or more. So smaller athletes are even worse in many cases. They may dehydrate by as much as 15% or more. An 8 kilo cut from a guy who's under 70 kilos, well, that's a 12-13% cut in his body weight. That's ultra extreme dehydration, according to the doctors. It's dangerous. It's considered dangerous, extremely dangerous, to cut more than 5% of your body weight. 2% is considered the outside limit of what's recoverable in a 24-hour period. Now, fighters typically fight within 24 hours of weighing in. So if you weigh in at 7 o'clock or 7:30 on a Friday night and you're due to fight on a Saturday night, you're barely recovered. If you've done the tiniest weight cut, you'll barely have recovered before your fight. If you've done more than a 3 or 4 kilo weight cut, and let's face it, most fighters do, then you will not have recovered. So what happens is fighters are going into fights with less protective cerebrospinal fluid around their brain. They're going in with lowered immune response, which also has other complications down the track, especially if they're injured, okay, in terms of complications and infections. But let's forget that for now. Let's just look at the brain. Your brain's main protection is the jelly-like cerebrospinal fluid that inhabits your spinal column and then completely encases your brain in a shock-absorbing fluid, gel-like fluid. And when you deplete that by comfortably 40% during a weight cut, you're making yourself, one, more prone to knockout, but you're also making yourself more prone to damage that would not occur at the same level or at all were your brain fully encased in its protective fluid. I ask why we're allowed to do this. There's so much concern about brain injuries in contact sports, and yet in many contact sports, in most, we allow this level, these regimes of weight cutting that put athletes at enormous risk, not just immediately, but long term. And again, some people are going to be able to recover. There are studies that have shown that some people are able to recover 2 or 3 times faster than others. Okay, there are slow, there's an average, and there's the ultra. Now the problem is that fighters fill in those gaps well and truly. Not all fighters fit into the ultra recovery folk, nor do they fit into the average folk. Some of them are going to be slow recoverers. They're going to find weight cuts really hard. But they have to, because otherwise they end up fighting a guy who's might be reasonably well recovered. It's happened to one of my fighters. And they're literally fighting someone more than 10 kilos heavier than them in muscle and bone. Giving away 5 kilos of muscle and bone is a big deal. Anyone who's fought understands this. Giving away 10 or more kilos, it's tantamount to suicide. I mean, unless there's an enormous skill level difference, which often there isn't, most of the time there isn't, you are in for a beating, okay? Especially if it's a striking sport. So I cannot understand, in light of the medical case for the reduction of CFS and its recovery, which takes 72 hours. If you deplete most people's cerebrospinal fluid, which is called CSF, it takes up to 3 days for that cerebrospinal fluid at 40% loss to recover. So people the next day are walking around severely dehydrated still, and they're going into fight dehydrated. They are not rehydrated. Now, there's no evidence either that IV lines substantially help with the recovery of CFF. So it replenishes the liquid in your tissues, particularly your muscle tissue, but it doesn't really help your spinal fluids and your brain fluids, and they're actually even more important by far. Okay, those recover at a particularly, what seems to be like a set rate. You can improve it somewhat with an IV, but it's not enough. You're not going to recover in 24 hours if you've depleted yourself by 40% or more of CSF. So that's the science, and I'll leave the links below so you can explore the actual work that's been done on this. It's dangerous, and we shouldn't allow it. People should have to have their weight tested randomly throughout the year. Promoters could easily do this, and it could do it in conjunction with clubs. Most coaches and most club owners would rather see their fighters not have to cut huge amounts of weight and just fight close to their own body weight. Now, agreeably, guys go into camp and they cut probably, it varies enormously, but they can cut 2 kilos, as little as 2 kilos and as many as 5 or 6 kilos during a camp. But you know what your walk around weight is pre-cut, pre-weight cut. You know what that is. So a week out from the fight, 2 weeks out, even 3 weeks out from the fight, you're pretty much where you're going to be naturally. And then the water loading, the salt baths, the saunas, the diuretics start. And there's an enormous risk that comes with that. I'd like to remove that from our industry. Of course, I don't have the power to do that, but I do have the power to get a video out like this that tells people that they're putting themselves and their students in danger, and that we need to get this to the authorities. We need to get people to understand that weight cutting is possibly the worst risk that a fighter ever undergoes, because it makes them vulnerable to the very thing that they're engaging in, which is contact and shock to the brain. Even grapplers experience shock to the brain. Even grapplers can die because of the stresses and the damage that's done so during the course of their combat and their contest. So we need to explore alternative options. My suggestion is that we test people several weeks before camp. So before the competition date. So if the competition dates, I've got a fighter coming up for Nisa Fury on February 15th. They should test them in January, mid-January, a month before, 3 weeks before. No more and no less than about 3 weeks before. Okay, but randomly. So the fighter has no clue whether they're going to be tested at week 4 or even as late as week 2. They don't know. You can't stay dehydrated for that long. It wouldn't work and it would mess up your training. So it's a particularly salient time to be testing the fighter's walk around weight. Now, if they come in and find that a fighter who's set themselves up for a fight at 61 is actually 70 or 71 or 72, they go, well, you can't fight. You're not fighting today. Or you're not fighting on the 15th, because there's no way in the world that you'll be that way without a massive cut, and we're trying to eliminate that. So if we did that, if fighters had to test their weight or had their weight independently tested. Now, I know a lot of promoters don't want to pay for that, but one guy could test all their fighters in the course of a couple of days. It wouldn't be hard at all, or a week, over a week. It's a part-time job at the most for a week, every few weeks, okay? And if promoters can't afford that, then perhaps they need to rethink their career options, because the safety of the fighters has got to come first. It has to come first. So I think we should be testing. People talk about complex hydration tests and things like that, maybe for the pros, okay? But that is outside the price range and the affordability of most smaller promoters, where most people are fighting in combat sports. Small tournaments, community tournaments, state level and so on. But it's well within the purview of those competitions, those competitive bodies and promoters, to be able to fund one person to test all their fighters over a week or two as a part-time job. It wouldn't cost them that much, and it would fundamentally improve the safety and the security of the fighters participating. It will also make for better fights. People would be knocked out less often. People would be, when injured, recover faster. There would be less risk of long-term injuries, because that's the other thing too. If you fight often enough and you're fighting dehydrated on a constant basis, your risk for Alzheimer's, and again, this is shown in multiple studies, your risk for Alzheimer's and other pugilistic dementia and other forms of neurological damage are much, much higher. And young men and women